Maybe you could just give us, in the course, we've set up 4 main frameworks, or ethical theoretical frameworks that we're looking at. As you might imagine, the consequentialist tradition, a kind of non-consequentialist alternative, the divine command theory, and then a kind of virtue theory tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what your general methodological approach to ethical theory is, whether it fits naturally into any of these camps or whether you think of it differently altogether.
Of the 4 possibilities you mentioned, I would fit most comfortably into the non-consequentialist group, though I think consequentialism as a theory has very considerable plausibility. I always worry that it may actually be right, but I don't accept consequentialism in any of its forms. I'm not attracted to virtue ethics, given my absence of religious beliefs. Divine command theory obviously has no appeal to me. But I, unlike many people who are non-consequentialists, don't have a moral theory that I think is the right theory. I work instead on particular problems, trying to understand which principles should guide our thinking in particular cases, what considerations are relevant, how they weigh against one another, that kind of thing. So I work really from the bottom up rather than from the top down, and my view is that ultimately we should hope to have a really good moral theory, but I don't think we have one yet, not one that I find plausible.
So just a quick follow-up on that. When you're looking for the principles out of the particular cases, doesn't the character of the principles start to lead you in the direction of one view or other? Maybe you're saying that that's when you start feeling like it must be something like a non-consequentialist view, because the principles you find yourself endorsing in that reflective equilibrium process look a little bit more non-consequentialist?
Well, yeah, consequentialism is a monistic theory. It gives us one criterion for right action. And what I find when I'm thinking about the cases is that one criterion doesn't capture everything that seems to be morally significant. What I do is to try to look for those other considerations that are morally significant. And there seem to be a number of them. I don't find thinking about virtue very illuminating in the problems that I address, but lots and lots of other considerations that don't necessarily have to do with consequences do matter. And of course there are very many different ways in which consequences are relevant to the assessment of an action. Consequentialism is a maximizing theory. If you're not someone who believes that one should be maximizing the good, then one has to see how much weight considerations of consequences have in relation to other factors that seem relevant to the morality of action.
Right. So when you start from cases in the way you're describing, do you have a theory about our responses to cases that shows why our kind of intuitive responses are reliable data or a good place to start from which to then look at generating principles?
I don't have a good theory about this. I tend to think, as some other philosophers do, that our intuitions are what we might call ethical appearances or seemings. This is the way things seem to us, and that is a good place to start, the way things seem to us morally. I don't think that our moral intuitions have any powerful epistemic authority, but I think that they have a kind of defeasible authority that enables us to start with them, and we try to seek consistency among our intuitions. We look for the deeper foundations for intuitions that seem to cohere nicely. But my own experience is that my own moral thinking tends to be terribly confused when I start out, and it stays fairly confused. But I do find that I make progress, and in making progress, I reject some beliefs that I have held in the past. And what that means is I often reject intuitions that I feel. Um, and it helps if I can find an explanation of why the intuitions that seem to me to be the weakest ones or the least reliable are in fact unreliable if they are if they might be a product of self-interest
Sure.
or some metaphysical beliefs that I might have that are doubtful or whatever, then that gives me a reason for being suspicious of those particular intuitions.
Okay. And just maybe one more methodological question. What do you say to somebody who is tempted by a kind of cultural relativism that would say, well, these intuitions are obviously a function of your background and your other beliefs and your other commitments, whether conscious or not, and of course your culture in general, such that we shouldn't think of them as any more than what you and your tribe might think about particular cases or how you might respond intuitively to particular cases? Why should we think of this as anything like a normative prescription for all rational beings or something like that?
Well, I don't, again, think that my intuitions are themselves in any way authoritative, but they do provide guidance towards beliefs that are better supported. And when I'm trying to find the beliefs that are better supported, I look to things that people at other times and other cultures have thought and believed. And one of the interesting things is that psychologists and experimental philosophers have been testing for people's intuitions about certain schematically described cases, and what they often find is that there's quite a bit of uniformity to people's intuitions across cultures. This is true of some of the very famous cases like what are called trolley cases and so on. You find that when you present people with situations in which moral choice has to be made, and you abstract away from a lot of the cultural details and so on, people surprisingly converge on the same answers to a very considerable degree.